The real estate attorney I eventually hired told me that most property disputes start with someone assuming. Not lying, not scheming, just assuming. A fence goes up along what feels like the right line. A dock gets built where it seems natural. Years pass. Everyone forgets to look at the actual paper. Mill Lake is not much to look at. Maybe 4 acres of water, more of a wide pond than a proper lake, ringed with cattails on the north end and a muddy little beach on the south. There are 3 docks, 2 of which wobble if you step on them wrong. The kind of place where kids catch bluegill on a Saturday and adults sit in folding chairs, pretending they're somewhere nicer. I had driven past it probably 100 times before I ever thought to ask who owned it. I was not looking to cause trouble when I bought the property. I want to be clear about that, because the way things went later, some people decided I had been planning it all from the start. I hadn't. I bought the house because it was a good price, had a finished basement, and backed up to what the listing described as a community water feature. That language, community water feature, is what made me pull the deed. It took a title search and about 40 minutes with a county assessor's website to find what should have been obvious to anybody who looked. The parcel attached to my lot extended 230 feet along the eastern shoreline of Mill Lake. Not the whole lake, but a significant piece of it, including the stretch where all 3 docks had been built. The HOA documents referred to the lake vaguely, in the way HOA documents often do when someone drafted them quickly and nobody asked hard questions. There was language about community access to open spaces. There was no language conveying ownership of any specific parcel. The deed was clear. The map was clear. The county records were clear. I spent a week just sitting with that information. I am not someone who enjoys confrontation, and I was new to the neighborhood. I introduced myself to people. I learned the recycling schedule. I attended one HOA meeting where the primary agenda item was whether holiday lights should be permitted before December 1st, and I voted with the majority. I noticed the docks. I noticed the boats. I noticed the hand-painted sign near the South Beach that said "Residents Only" in red letters on a white board, the paint starting to peel at the corners. I noticed that the woman who seemed to run things, who sat at the front of every HOA meeting with a legal pad and a very particular expression, was the same woman I had seen walking the docks on 2 separate occasions, stopping to talk to the boat owners in the way someone talks to tenants. I did not say anything yet. I just watched and noted, the way you do when you think you understand something, but want to be sure before you open your mouth. A neighbor told me over the fence one afternoon that the dock spaces rented for $200 a season, 6 boats. He said it like he was sharing pleasant neighborhood trivia. He did not seem to think there was anything unusual about it. He had assumed, the way everyone had, that the arrangement was official, sanctioned, part of the normal functioning of the community. I went home and pulled out the deed again, looked at the parcel lines, looked at where the dock sat in relation to those lines. Then I called a surveyor. Diana had been on the HOA board for 11 years. That's not a tenure, that's her occupation. She had opinions about mailbox colors, about the acceptable height of ornamental grasses, about whether wind chimes constituted a noise nuisance under the community guidelines. Spoiler, she had ruled that they did. What Diane also had, for at least the last 4 or 5 years by my best count, was a quiet little income stream that nobody had thought to question. Here's how it worked. 6 households in the community owned boats. Nothing dramatic, a couple of base fishing rigs, 1 pontoon that got used maybe 4 weekends a year, a canoe that I'm pretty sure hadn't touched water since the Obama administration. These families needed somewhere to keep their boats close. The HOA didn't have official dock space, didn't have a policy about it, didn't have much of anything written down about Mill Lake, beyond a vague reference to it as a community amenity in the original covenants. That vagueness was the whole business model. Diane had approached each of these households personally at some point and offered them dock access. Informal agreements, month to month, cash or Venmo, depending on the household. The rates weren't outrageous. She wasn't greedy, just steady. Somewhere between $80 and $120 per month per slip, from what I was eventually able to piece together. Run the numbers and you're looking at somewhere north of $500 a month, going directly into Diane's personal account, not the HOA account. Not a community fund, hers. The boat owners weren't bad people. I want to be clear about that. They had been told by a board member, someone in a position of apparent authority, that this was an available arrangement. They paid their fees. They assumed everything was above board, because why wouldn't they? Nobody told them to go check the deed on the shoreline. Nobody told them because the person collecting their money had a strong personal interest in them not doing that. I found out about the arrangement gradually. The way you find out about most things in a neighborhood, through conversation, through small comments that didn't quite add up, through noticing a pattern. A neighbor mentioned paying Diane for the season. Another mentioned renewing. By the time I had closed on my property and started going through the deed with any real attention, I had a pretty clear picture of what was happening. Now, I'm not someone who goes looking for conflict. I genuinely am not. I had no interest in making enemies in a neighborhood I'd just moved into. But there is something particular about discovering that someone has been collecting rent on property that is legally yours. Not community property, not contested property, yours. And doing it with complete confidence that no one would ever check. That confidence was the part that sat with me. Diane wasn't running this operation out of desperation. She had a nice house. She drove a recent model SUV. This was not a woman supplementing a fixed income. This was a woman who had looked at an asset that didn't belong to her, recognized that nobody was watching, and decided that made it available. She'd been doing it for years before I arrived. She would have kept doing it indefinitely. The boat owners would have kept paying. The HOA would have kept having no idea. And Mill Lake would have kept being, in every practical sense, Diane's lake. That's the part I kept coming back to. Not the money, though the money was a real thing. The assumption. The absolute unexamined certainty that because something had always worked a certain way, it would keep working that way forever. I've found, in my experience, that this particular certainty is usually the thing that makes the correction so satisfying when it finally comes. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The markers were plain orange plastic, the kind you can order in bulk off any surveying supply website. Nothing fancy. I wasn't trying to make a statement. I was trying to document a property line that had been ignored for so long that half the neighborhood had apparently forgotten it existed. I started on a Saturday morning, early, before the heat settled in. I had the survey pins located from a previous walkthrough with a licensed surveyor, and I just worked my way along the shoreline, pressing each marker into the soft ground at the intervals he'd flagged. It took maybe 2 hours. I had coffee in a thermos. It was a perfectly uneventful morning right up until it wasn't. I heard her before I saw her. That particular register of voice, not quite yelling, but loud enough that you know the volume is intentional, carrying across the water from the direction of the dock. I looked up and Diane was standing at the edge of the grass, about 40 yards away, phone already at her ear, one arm extended toward me like she was identifying a suspect in a lineup. I kept working. She stayed on the phone for a while. I finished the last 3 markers on the southern stretch, capped my thermos, and sat down on a flat rock at the water's edge to wait. Because I knew what was coming and there was no reason to be anywhere else. The officer who arrived was young, maybe late 20s, and he had the careful, neutral expression of someone who has responded to enough neighbor disputes to know that the truth usually lives somewhere in the paperwork. He introduced himself, explained he'd received a report of trespassing on community property, and asked if I'd be willing to walk him through what I was doing. I said absolutely. I had the deed in a manila folder. I also had the survey report, the assessor's parcel map with the lot lines highlighted, and a single-page summary my real estate attorney had put together that basically translated the legal language into plain English. I handed the officer the folder. He read. Diane, who had followed him over, started explaining that the lake had always been considered community property, that everyone knew it, that the original developer had intended it that way. The officer looked up from the folder and asked her if she had documentation of that. She said it was common knowledge. He looked back down at the folder. He spent about 10 minutes with it, asked me 2 clarifying questions. One about the survey date, one about whether there were any easements running across the parcel. I answered both. He handed the folder back, turned to Diane, and told her in a tone that was genuinely kind that the property appeared to be privately owned, that the markers were consistent with a lawful boundary installation, and that there was nothing actionable here from his end. Diane said she was going to call the HOA attorney. He told her that sounded like a reasonable next step. Then he thanked us both for our time, walked back to his cruiser, and left. I picked up my thermos and my folder. Diane was still standing there, looking at the markers like they were something I had done to her personally. Maybe in her accounting of things I had. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that the survey pins and the orange plastic hadn't already said more clearly than I could. I went home. I made a second cup of coffee. I sat on my back steps and looked out toward the water. Then I gave it a few days. Let it breathe. The impulse when something like that happens is to move fast, to press whatever advantage you've just established before anyone has time to regroup. I've learned that impulse is almost always wrong. The paperwork was solid. The clock wasn't going anywhere. Neither were the boats. The officer's cruiser was gone before I even made it back inside. I watched the taillights disappear around the curve on Pembroke Drive and stood there in my own yard for a minute, just listening to the lake. That's the thing about Mill Lake in late afternoon. When the wind sits down and the light goes flat, it makes almost no sound at all. Just this low, soft pressure against the air, like the whole surface is exhaling. I'd been so busy with deed research and boundary stakes and Diane's increasingly creative interpretations of property law that I hadn't just stood there and listened to it in weeks. I went inside and made a sandwich. This is the part people don't believe when I tell the story. They expect that I immediately drafted letters, or called my attorney, or did something satisfying and tactical. I didn't. I ate a turkey sandwich over the kitchen sink and watched a heron work the far bank for about 20 minutes. The heron caught something. I finished the sandwich. That was Tuesday. The waiting wasn't weakness and it wasn't strategy exactly. It was closer to what you do after you've said the right thing in an argument and you know it landed. You don't keep talking. Talking after the thing is already done is just noise, and noise gives people something to respond to. Silence makes them wait for you instead. I knew what Diane was doing in those days because Mill Lake is a small community and people talk. She'd called 2 of the boat owners the same night the officer left. She was describing the situation, from what I heard, as under review and being handled. She used the phrase legal ambiguity with enough confidence that at least one of those neighbors apparently believed her. She floated the idea that the HOA might pursue some kind of adverse possession claim, which, I respect the creativity. It had been 2 years of documented, posted, deed-recorded ownership, but sure. What she didn't do was contact me directly. Not a phone call, not a note, not a knock on the door. I think she was hoping I'd get impatient, that I'd do something loud and give her something to work with at the next board meeting, reclassify me as a problem neighbor rather than a property owner exercising rights. I've watched her do it to other people. The Rodriguez family 2 streets over put up a pergola with the correct permits, and Diane ran a 4-month campaign about sight lines before she ran out of steam. It works when people get defensive. It stops working when people stay quiet and keep their paperwork in order. So I kept quiet and kept my paperwork in order. On day 4, I called my attorney. Not to file anything, just to talk through timing. She said 30 days was generous, but reasonable, and that certified mail with return receipt would be the move. She also said to keep the tone of the letters completely neutral, no accusations, nothing that read as hostile. Just fact. Just, here is what is true. Here is what it means for you. Here is the timeline. I spent 2 evenings writing those letters. 6 versions of essentially the same document, each one addressed to a specific boat owner by name. I looked up each of their vessels, 2 pontoon boats, 3 fishing boats, 1 extremely optimistic speedboat for a lake this size, and referenced them specifically. Nothing says you've done your homework like knowing a man's boat is a 2019 Tracker Pro 170 with a trolling motor and a canvas cover that's seen better days. I sealed the envelopes on a Thursday night, drove them to the post office Friday morning before work. Then I went back to the lake and listened to it for a while. The heron was there again. The letters went out on a Tuesday. I remember because the post office on Tanner Street only has 1 certified mail window open on Tuesdays, and I stood in line behind a man returning something in a box the size of a small refrigerator. I had 6 envelopes. I wasn't in a hurry. I'd spent the better part of the previous week drafting them. Not because the language was complicated. My attorney had given me a template that covered the essentials in about 4 paragraphs, but because I wanted the tone exactly right. There's a version of this letter that reads like a threat. There's a version that reads like an apology. I didn't want either. What I wanted was a letter that read the way a property survey reads. Factual, precise, and completely indifferent to how you feel about it. Each owner received the same thing. A brief explanation that the dock and the surrounding shoreline had been confirmed, by recorded deed, to be attached to my lot. A clear statement that any rental arrangement made with a third party regarding that property had no legal standing and could not be honored. A 30-day window to remove their vessels. And a line at the bottom noting that I was happy to answer questions in writing. That last part was my attorney's suggestion. In writing. Not by phone, not at the mailbox, not in the driveway. In writing. The responses came in waves. The first was almost immediate. A couple named the Hoffmans, who kept a little aluminum fishing boat at the far end of the dock. Doug Hoffman knocked on my door 2 days after the letter arrived. He was sheepish about the whole thing in the way that decent people are when they realize they've been participating in something they shouldn't have been. He said he'd never seen any paperwork, just paid Diane cash every spring, and assumed it was some kind of HOA amenity. He had the boat gone within a week. We shook hands. It was fine. The second wave was more complicated. 2 owners sent letters back. Actual letters, not emails, informing me that they intended to contest the matter and had spoken with their own attorneys. I forwarded both to my attorney. She wrote back to their attorneys. I don't know exactly what was exchanged, but neither of those boats was still at the dock by day 22. The third wave was Diane. She didn't send a letter. She organized. Within 48 hours of the certified notices hitting mailboxes, she had worked her way through the HOA phone tree with a version of events in which I was a predatory newcomer, attempting to steal community resources through legal manipulation. I know this because 3 separate neighbors mentioned some version of it to me, each with the slightly uncomfortable expression of someone who suspects they're being used as a messenger. I didn't respond to any of it. There was nothing to respond to. The deed said what it said. The certified mail receipts showed what they showed. The 30-day clock was running, and running is exactly what clocks do. What I noticed in those weeks of waiting was how much of Diane's power had always depended on nobody checking anything. The boat owners hadn't checked. The HOA board hadn't checked. Whatever the original arrangement had been when the community was developed, nobody had gone back to the source documents to see how the pieces actually fit together. Diane had simply occupied the space that the absence of information created, and she'd done it long enough that the occupation started to look like ownership. That's not a legal argument. It's just what I observed from my back porch, watching the water. By day 28, there were 2 boats left. By day 30, there were none. I walked the dock that evening. The wood was soft in a few places and would need attention in the spring. The cleats were old. There was a faded orange bumper wedged under one of the pilings that nobody had claimed. I left it there. It seemed like a reasonable thing to keep. Diane sent the meeting notice on a Tuesday, which gave her exactly 48 hours to work the phones. By the time Thursday evening arrived, the community room at the rec center had more folding chairs than I had ever seen arranged in that space. People were sitting in the back along the wall. Someone had propped the side door open with a brick because the air conditioning was losing the argument. I got there early and took a seat near the middle. Not the front, that would have read as aggressive, but close enough that I wouldn't have to raise my voice. My attorney, a quiet man named Gerald, who charged by the hour and seemed entirely unbothered by the energy in the room, sat to my left with a legal pad he never once wrote on. Diane opened the meeting without preamble. She had a printed presentation, actual laminated pages, which she passed down each row like a church bulletin. The top read Mill Lake, our shared community asset in a font that had clearly been chosen to communicate seriousness. She walked through the history of the lake as she understood it, common use, decades of access. The community's assumed ownership. She said the word assumed without appearing to notice what it meant. 3 people spoke before I did. One man, barrel-chested, red in the face, said that his family had been keeping a boat on that dock for 11 years. Another woman said this felt like theft, and several people nodded. A third resident asked whether the HOA had legal standing to challenge the deed, which was the first useful question of the evening. Diane said she had been consulting with someone, which was not an answer. Then she looked at me. I thanked everyone for coming. I said I understood that this was disruptive and that I had not set out to disrupt anyone. I kept my voice level. Gerald had advised me not to perform anything. No satisfaction, no apology either. Just the facts, stated plainly, in order. I said that the deed was clear and had been clear since the original subdivision filing. I said that I had obtained a survey, which I had, and that the survey confirmed the boundary markers I had placed were accurate. I said that the 30-day notices had been issued as a courtesy, not a requirement. Then Gerald slid a single page down the table toward Diane. It was a summary of the rental payments she had collected from the 6 boat owners over the past 4 years, pulled together from what 2 of those owners had voluntarily shared with me. The number at the bottom of the page was not enormous, but it was specific, and specific numbers have a way of landing differently than general accusations. The room went quiet. Diane said that was a private arrangement and had nothing to do with the current matter. Gerald said, pleasantly, that it might have something to do with how the HOA wanted to characterize its own governance going forward. Someone in the back asked how Diane had been collecting rent on property the HOA didn't own and where that money had gone. This was not addressed to me. This was addressed to the other board members, 2 of whom were sitting at the far end of the table, looking like they had only just understood what meeting they were attending. The vote on whether to pursue a legal challenge to the deed failed. 4 in favor, 9 opposed, 2 abstentions. Gerald and I were in the parking lot by 8:15. He said I had done well. I said I appreciated him coming. He said he would send an invoice, and he did. The drive home took 4 minutes. The lake was dark and flat at the edge of my property, and I sat on the back steps for a while before going inside. The 30 days passed the way a held breath finally releases. Not with a bang, but with a slow, complete exhale. I didn't stand at my window counting down. I had things to do. The attorney had sent follow-up notices on day 15, as we'd planned. Just a gentle reminder that the calendar was still moving. Two of the boat owners called me directly after that one. Both were decent enough about it. One man named Gerald said he'd never known the dock situation wasn't above board, and I believed him. He had the sheepish tone of someone who just realized they'd been handed a bad check by a person they trusted. He moved his boat out that same weekend. The others trickled out over the following 2 weeks. A pontoon with a torn canopy. A fishing boat that had clearly not been in the water in at least one full season. A ski boat the color of a highlighter that belonged to a couple in the cul-de-sac, who I'd waved to exactly once. Each one left without incident. Each one had presumably had some version of a conversation with Diane that I was not present for, and based on the silence I was getting from that direction, I suspected those conversations had not gone well for her. By the morning of day 28, there were 2 boats left. I noted this without particular urgency. The attorney had already prepared the next step. We didn't need drama. We just needed patience and documentation, both of which were available in good supply. Day 30 came on a Tuesday. I made coffee. I walked down to the dock at about 7 in the morning while the mist was still sitting on the water. The 2 remaining boats were gone. There was nothing left on my dock but the dock itself. Weathered planks, 2 aluminum cleats, a decade of other people's use baked into the wood. I stood there for a while. The lake was quiet in the way small lakes are quiet in the morning, which is to say not fully silent, but calm in a way that feels intentional. A heron was standing in the shallows on the far side, doing what herons do, which is mostly just exist with a kind of focused indifference to everything around them. I respected that about the heron. What I felt standing there was not triumphant exactly. Triumph implies a contest with a clear opponent and a moment of victory. And this hadn't been that. It had been a process, a long documented, carefully worded process that moved in one direction because the facts only permitted movement in one direction. That's not a win so much as an outcome. The distinction matters to me. I thought about the 6 families who had paid Diane for years under the reasonable assumption they were paying for something she had the right to sell. I thought about Gerald's tone on the phone. I thought about the pontoon with the torn canopy and whoever had dragged it out of the water and loaded it onto a trailer without ceremony or explanation. There was a low-grade unfairness to all of it that wasn't mine to fix but was mine to notice. Then I thought about what came next. The dock was solid. The shoreline was mine. The water was clean and the access was good, and I had already made a few calls the previous week. Just exploratory, just to understand what it would take to put a small fleet of kayaks in the water on a seasonal basis. The numbers were not complicated. The paperwork was less complicated than the HOA had been. The lake was calm. I walked back up to the house and refilled my coffee. Diane's car was already out front, 2 doors down. She was photographing my trash cans. The bin had been out since Monday because I'd forgotten to pull it back in after collection. I waved. She did not wave back. Some things don't change. That's fine. The dock does. The kayaks were my wife's idea. I want to be honest about that because I've told this story enough times now that I sometimes let people assume the whole thing was some master plan I had from the beginning. It wasn't I bought the property because I liked the property. I documented the deed because I'm the kind of person who reads documents. I sent the certified letters because I had to. The kayaks came later, and they came from my wife standing at the kitchen window one morning looking out at the water and saying, "You know what that dock needs?" We started with 4 kayaks, bought them used, sanded a couple down, repainted them in colors she picked out, a dark green, a faded orange, 2 yellows. We put a small hand-painted sign at the road, nothing fancy. The kind of sign that looks like a kid made it, which honestly helps. People trust a sign that looks like a kid made it. The first summer was slow. A few families from outside the neighborhood, some teenagers on a Saturday afternoon, a retired couple who came back 3 weekends in a row and always brought their own water shoes. We didn't get rich. We covered the cost of the kayaks by July and everything. After that felt like a bonus. What I didn't expect was how much I'd like being down at the dock. There's something about handing someone a paddle and watching them push off from the bank that gets me every time. People are nervous for about 30 seconds, and then they're not. The lake is small enough that you can always see both shores, so nobody ever feels truly lost out there. Kids figure out the steering faster than adults. Adults figure out that they don't actually need to steer that hard. By the time most people come back in, they're quieter than when they left. Not sad quiet. Just settled. I've had maybe 2 or 3 encounters with Diane since the meeting. They have been brief. She doesn't photograph my trash cans anymore. Or if she does, she's gotten more discreet about it. The 6 boat owners mostly kept their distance for a while, which I understood. A couple of them have actually rented kayaks. One of them, a guy named Patrick, who had a little fishing boat he'd kept at the dock for years, stopped by last fall and said he'd been thinking about what happened, and he wanted me to know he hadn't realized the arrangement with Diane wasn't above board. I told him I believed him. We talked about the lake for a while. He said his grandfather used to fish it. I said mine would have liked it. I don't know what Diane gets out of still being on the board. That's not a mean question. I've genuinely thought about it. Some people need the feeling of jurisdiction. They need there to be a place where their assessment of things is the official one. I think the lake was that for her, and now it isn't, and I don't think any other part of the board work fills that in the same way. I could be wrong, I'm not a psychologist. What I know is that on a clear weekend morning before the rentals start, I'll walk down to the dock with a cup of coffee and just sit there. The water does that thing where it holds the early light before the rest of the world catches up. The kayaks knock softly against the dock in whatever small current is moving through. Nobody is fighting about anything. Nobody is calling anybody. The deed is filed. The letters were sent. The meeting happened. The lake was always mine on paper. It just took a while for everything else to catch up to that fact. Now it's mine in every way that counts.